The city was restless with the cold, a biting chill that seeped into bones and lingered in the air. In a small corner behind a bustling cafe, John Mitchell sat on a flattened cardboard box, his few belongings bundled tightly beside him. John was a veteran in his late 60s, a man whose years of military service were etched into his face through a hardened jawline and eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. His hands, rough and calloused, trembled slightly as he held a small cup of coffee given to him by a passing stranger. This warm cup, a simple kindness, was rare in his world. To everyone else on the bustling street, John was invisible, just another shadow in the background of their busy lives. But John hadn't always been invisible. Once he was Sergeant John Mitchell, a leader, a protector, someone people looked up to. Yet somewhere between battles on foreign soil and struggles within his own mind, his life had taken a dark turn. After returning home, the civilian world, once familiar, seemed alien. His friends had moved on, his family grew distant, and the job he was promised fell through. Before he knew it, he was on the streets, alone and struggling to navigate a society that seemed to have forgotten him. The days blurred together, each one colder and harsher than the last. John had learned to survive on little, rationing meals from shelters, and finding solace in the few moments of humanity extended to him. One such moment came from the cafe manager, who occasionally handed him leftovers. However, that fragile kindness was shattered one cold evening when the manager, concerned about the image of the establishment, made a call to the police. A few minutes later, an officer arrived, his expression stern but not unkind. "Sir, you can't stay here," the officer said, his voice firm. "You're trespassing." John didn't argue. Years of discipline had taught him to follow orders without question. Quietly, he picked up his few possessions, stood and prepared to leave. But as he turned, the officer grabbed his arm. "I'm sorry, sir, but we've had complaints," the officer added, his tone softer but resolute. John's heart sank. He'd hoped, just this once, to be left in peace. Instead, he was led away and booked at the station for trespassing. Sitting in the corner of the holding cell, the steel of the bench pressed coldly into his bones. His mind felt numb as he thought about the thousands of nights he had spent like this, alone, forgotten, and unwanted. When the officers gave him a date for a court hearing, John nodded, his voice a mere whisper as he agreed to appear. Deep down, he wondered if it even mattered anymore. On the day of his hearing, John walked into the courtroom with his head held low. He didn't expect sympathy. He never did. He wore a mismatched jacket donated from the shelter, and a pair of shoes that pinched his toes. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in front of him, waiting for his name to be called. The room was filled with whispered judgments and curious glances from the attendees. In their eyes, John was just another homeless man who had likely made a mess of his life. The judge entered the room, and everyone rose in respect. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. As she took her seat, she began reading through the cases lined up before her. Finally, she reached John's file. Her gaze scanned the room, settling on him. "John Mitchell," she called, her voice strong and formal. John raised his hand slightly and nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. The judge began reading through his file, but something caught her attention. Her voice trailed off as she paused, reading over a line a second time. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as if in recognition. "John Mitchell," she repeated, softer this time, almost as if to herself. John shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, wondering why she was taking such an interest in him. The judge put down the file and looked him directly in the eye, an unusual warmth in her expression. "Mr. Mitchell," she began slowly, her voice wavering slightly, "were you by chance in the 80th Airborne Division?" The room grew quiet as everyone listened intently. John's eyes widened, a flood of memories rushing back. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly, nodding. "That was me. I served a long time ago." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of those memories almost too much to bear. The judge leaned back in her chair, her eyes misty as she continued. "Mr. Mitchell, my brother served in that same division. He often told us stories about a man who saved his life. Someone he described as courageous, selfless, a true hero. That man's name was John Mitchell." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "You're that man, aren't you?" A gasp rippled through the courtroom. as everyone's perception of John began to shift. No longer was he just another homeless man. He was a hero, a veteran who had risked everything for his country. John nodded, his throat tight, barely able to speak. "I did my duty, ma'am. I just did what I thought was right," he murmured, looking down, humbled by her words. The judge cleared her throat, visibly moved. She composed herself before addressing the court. "This man," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong, "served our country with more courage than many of us can comprehend. And yet he stands here today, facing charges for simply trying to find shelter. This is a man who deserves our utmost respect, not condemnation." She turned to John, her voice now gentle. "Mr. Mitchell, I am dismissing these charges. Furthermore, I am ordering immediate assistance for you. You deserve more than this. You deserve support, stability, and a place to call home." Tears welled up in John's eyes, and for the first time in years he felt seen, truly seen, not as a burden or failure, but as someone who mattered. The crowd, once judgmental, now looked at him with admiration. Strangers approached afterward, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, and offering words of encouragement. For the first time in years, John felt hope, a warmth that melted the years of cold he had endured. As John left the courtroom that day, tears streamed down his face, not from sadness but from gratitude. The weight he had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a glimmer of optimism. He wasn't invisible anymore. After the hearing, the judge personally arranged for John to be connected with a veterans outreach program. Within days, he was provided with temporary housing and access to counseling services. The program staff listened to his story with genuine interest, helping him feel valued once again. Slowly, John began to rebuild his life. At the shelter, he met others who shared similar stories, veterans who had faced hardship after returning home. Together, they formed a small community, supporting one another through their struggles. John began to volunteer, sharing his experiences and mentoring younger veterans who were just starting to navigate civilian life. One day, as he walked through the city, he passed the cafe where his troubles had begun. The manager who had called the police recognized him and hesitated, unsure of what to say. To her surprise, John simply smiled and nodded, his heart free of bitterness. He had found peace and forgiveness, and was determined to move forward. Months later, John was invited to speak at a community event honoring veterans. Standing on the stage, he shared his story, not just of his service, but of his struggles and the kindness that had brought him back from the brink. His words moved the audience, inspiring many to take action to support those who had served. By the end of the year, John had secured a small apartment, decorated with mementos from his past and new tokens of hope. On his wall hung a framed photo of his unit, a reminder of the brotherhood that had shaped him. He also kept a letter from the judge, thanking him for his service and expressing her gratitude for the sacrifices he had made. John Mitchell's journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, he faced the future with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer defined by his struggles, but by his resilience and the community that had rallied around him. And as he sat by his window, sipping a warm cup of coffee, he allowed himself to dream of brighter days ahead. Subscribe now for more interesting stories.